The summer of 1916 brought with it something Europe had never witnessed before. On a stretch of rolling countryside in northern France, where the river Somme meandered peacefully, through farmland and villages, the most catastrophic single day in British military history was about to unfold. What happened on July 1st would shatter not just the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, but the very soul of a nation. This is the story of how one morning's attack became a massacre, so complete, so devastating, that it would forever change the way the world understood the true cost of war. 60,000 casualties in a single day. 19,000 dead before the sun had reached its peak. Entire neighborhoods back home would be wiped out by telegram after telegram, bearing the worst possible news. Fathers, sons, brothers and friends who had marched off to war together would never return home. The Somme wasn't just a battle, it was the day hope died on the Western Front. To understand how this catastrophe unfolded, we need to step back into the minds of the men who planned it. The year 1916 had begun with grand ambitions. After nearly 2 years of deadlock in the muddy hell of trench warfare, the Allied commanders believed they had found the key to victory. A massive coordinated assault that would finally break the German lines and end the war. They called it the Big Push. What they got instead was the big tragedy. The architect of this disaster was Field Marshal Douglas Haig, a man whose name would become synonymous with military incompetence and senseless slaughter. Yet in the spring of 1916, Haig was confident, even optimistic. He had inherited a plan that promised to coordinate attacks across multiple fronts. Russia would strike in the east, Italy would press from the south, and Britain and France would deliver the knockout blow on the Western Front along the River Somme. The location wasn't chosen for its strategic value. No vital railways to capture, no crucial ports to seize. The Somme was selected for one simple reason. It was where the British and French armies stood side by side. After bearing the brunt of the fighting since 1914, the French were determined to see their British allies contribute their fair share to the bloodshed. What they didn't anticipate was how much blood would be spilled. The plan seemed foolproof on paper. British artillery would unleash the most devastating bombardment in military history. For 7 straight days, the guns would pound German positions with over 1.5 million shells. The constant thunder would be so intense, it could be heard across the English Channel in London. Surely, the planners reasoned, no human being could survive such an apocalyptic barrage. When the shells stopped falling, British infantry would simply walk across no man's land and occupy the shattered German trenches. They were catastrophically wrong. What the British commanders failed to understand was that their enemy had been preparing for this moment for nearly 2 years. While British soldiers shivered in waterlogged trenches, German engineers had been digging, not just trenches, but underground cities. These were elaborate fortifications, some 40 feet beneath the earth, complete with electric lighting, kitchens, and comfortable sleeping quarters. When British shells began to fall, German soldiers simply disappeared underground, waiting patiently in their concrete bunkers for the storm to pass. The bombardment that was supposed to destroy German defenses had another fatal flaw. 2/3 of those 1.5 million shells were shrapnel rounds, designed to kill men in the open, not destroy fortified positions. British munitions factories were producing defective ammunition. It's estimated that nearly 1 in 3 shells failed to explode entirely. The barbed wire that was supposed to be blown apart remained largely intact, creating deadly tangles that would trap attacking soldiers like fish in a net. The most tragic element of this disaster was the men who would pay the ultimate price for their commanders' miscalculations. These weren't the hardened professional soldiers of Britain's small peacetime army. Those men had been largely wiped out. Instead, the Somme would be fought by Kitchener's new army, volunteers who had answered their country's call with patriotic enthusiasm. Among these volunteers were some of the most remarkable units in British military history, the Pals Battalions. When recruitment began in 1914, local communities had been promised that friends, neighbors, and workmates could serve together. Entire football teams enlisted as one. Factory workers joined with their colleagues. University students marched to war alongside their classmates. The idea seemed brilliant for morale. Men would fight harder knowing their mates were beside them. The reality would prove heartbreaking beyond measure. Take the Accrington Pals, drawn from a small Lancashire town. 720 men had volunteered together, trained together, and crossed the Channel together. They represented the pride of their community. On July 1st, they would attack the village of Sayre at the northern end of the British assault. Within 20 minutes of going over the top, 584 of them would be casualties. 235 would never see home again. The Sheffield City Battalion, nicknamed the Sheffield Pals, were drawn from the steel workers and craftsmen who had built Britain's industrial might. 495 would fall in a single morning's attack. The Leeds Pals lost 750 of their 900 participants. The Grimsby Chums were cut down in waves. Entire streets back home would receive telegrams on the same day. Entire neighborhoods would go into mourning simultaneously. This wasn't just military defeat. This was social catastrophe on an unprecedented scale. As dawn broke on July 1st, 1916, the British artillery fell silent for the first time in 7 days. In the sudden quiet, German soldiers emerged from their underground shelters, brushed off the concrete dust, and manned their machine guns. They peered across no man's land through the morning mist and could hardly believe what they saw. Long lines of British soldiers, laden down with heavy equipment, walking slowly and deliberately toward their positions. Not running, not taking cover, but walking in neat, orderly rows as if they were on a parade ground rather than a battlefield. The British battle plan was based on the assumption that there would be no organized resistance left after the bombardment. Soldiers were ordered to advance at walking pace to maintain formation. They carried 60 pounds of equipment each, including tools to consolidate captured trenches. Many commanders, doubtful that these civilian volunteers could handle complex tactics, had ordered them to advance in rigid lines with precise intervals between each man. The German machine gunners couldn't miss. As the first waves of British infantry approached the German wire, which remained largely uncut despite the week-long bombardment, the slaughter began. Machine guns that were supposed to have been destroyed opened fire from concealed positions. Artillery that should have been silenced rained shells down on the attacking formations. Men who had walked confidently from their trenches expecting an easy victory instead walked into the most devastating defensive fire in military history. The carnage was so complete, so overwhelming, that some German machine gunners reportedly stopped firing out of sheer horror at what they were witnessing. But the British kept coming. Wave after wave of men climbing out of their trenches, walking into the storm of steel, and falling by the thousands. By the end of that terrible day, the British Army had suffered 57,000 casualties. 19,240 men had been killed. It remains the bloodiest single day in British military history. The big push had advanced just a few hundred yards in most places, nowhere near the breakthrough that had been promised. The war that was supposed to end by Christmas 1914 would drag on for 2 more agonizing years, but the true tragedy of the Somme wasn't just measured in casualty statistics. It was measured in the destruction of an entire generation's faith in their leaders, their cause, and their future. The flower of British youth had been cut down in a single morning, and the scars would last for generations. The aftermath of that first catastrophic day revealed the true horror of what had transpired. As darkness fell over the battlefield, the sounds of wounded men crying out from no man's land filled the night air. Stretcher bearers worked frantically to retrieve the injured, but thousands lay beyond reach in the deadly ground between the trenches. Some would remain there for days, slowly dying of their wounds, while German and British snipers made rescue attempts impossible. Back in Britain, the telegraph wires hummed with devastating news. The War Office had prepared for casualties, but nothing on this scale. Telegraph operators worked through the night, sending thousands upon thousands of notifications to families across the country. In Accrington, the postmen refused to deliver the telegrams, knowing that each envelope contained news that would destroy a family. In Sheffield, entire streets fell silent as neighbors realized that their local battalion had been virtually wiped out. The newspapers, still bound by wartime censorship, could only hint at the scale of the disaster. Headlines spoke of successful operations and ground gained, But the casualty lists told a different story. Page after page of names, photographs of young men who would never return home. The Accrington Observer and Times ran story after story of local heroes who had fallen. Percy Holmes, whose brother had served with the Pals, remembered the day the news reached home. The entire town seemed to go into collective mourning. What made the tragedy even more bitter was how preventable it had been. Military experts on both sides had warned about the futility of frontal assaults against prepared positions. The German army had learned these lessons through bitter experience at Verdun, where they had discovered that artillery alone could never completely suppress determined defenders. Yet British commanders had ignored these warnings, convinced that their massive bombardment would succeed where others had failed. The German defenders themselves were shocked by the slaughter they had witnessed. Many had expected the British attack to be called off when it became clear that the bombardment had failed. Lieutenant Colonel Badal of the German 169th Infantry Regiment later wrote that his men were horrified by the sight of British soldiers walking into certain death. Some German units actually ceased firing, unable to continue the massacre of such brave but misguided men. But the most damning evidence of the day's futility came from the few places where British forces had achieved success. On the southern end of the attack, where French forces had coordinated more effectively with their artillery, significant gains were made with relatively light casualties. The French had learned to use their guns more precisely, targeting specific strongpoints rather than conducting the broad bombardment favored by the British. Their infantry advanced in small groups, using cover and speed rather than the rigid lines that had proven so disastrous elsewhere. These tactical successes were ignored by British High Command. Instead of learning from the day's lessons, Field Marshal Haig doubled down on his strategy of attrition. The battle would continue for months, each day bringing fresh casualties for minimal gains. The Somme had become a meat grinder, consuming entire divisions for the sake of a few hundred yards of cratered mud. The psychological impact on the survivors was perhaps as devastating as the physical casualties. Men who had witnessed their friends and brothers cut down in minutes struggled to understand how such carnage could have been ordered by their own commanders. The blind faith that had characterized British soldiers in the early years of the war began to crumble. Letters home spoke not of glory and heroism, but of waste and futility. Private Arthur Wrench of the London Scottish wrote to his family describing the aftermath of the attack. He had watched entire companies disappear into the smoke and chaos, never to return. The ground was so thick with bodies that survivors had to step carefully to avoid treading on the dead. The smell of death hung over the battlefield for weeks, a constant reminder of the day's horror. The medical services, already stretched to breaking point, were completely overwhelmed. Field hospitals designed to handle hundreds of wounded were suddenly faced with tens of thousands of casualties. Doctors worked without rest, performing surgery by candlelight when the electric generators failed. Many wounded men died not from their injuries, but from the simple lack of medical attention. The lucky ones were evacuated to hospitals in England, but even there the scale of suffering was unprecedented. Among the wounded were men who would carry the physical and mental scars of July 1st for the rest of their lives. Shell shock, then barely understood by military doctors, affected thousands of survivors. Men who had shown incredible courage under fire found themselves unable to function in civilian life, haunted by memories of friends dying beside them. The term survivor's guilt had not yet been coined, but the condition was all too real. The families left behind faced their own struggles. Widows suddenly found themselves alone with children to raise and no income to support them. The government's pension system was inadequate for the scale of loss. Entire communities had to band together to support the families of the fallen. In Accrington, a fund was established to help the widows and orphans of the Pals, but no amount of money could fill the void left by so many lost fathers and husbands. The class system that had defined British society was also shattered by the Somme. The idea that upper-class officers would lead working-class men to glorious victory had been exposed as a deadly delusion. Many of the Pals Battalions had been led by local businessmen and aristocrats who had bought their commissions rather than earning them through military training. These amateur soldiers, however well-intentioned, had lacked the tactical knowledge to adapt when their plans went wrong. Yet even as the immediate horror of July 1st sank in, the battle continued. Haig, rather than acknowledging the failure of his tactics, ordered more attacks. The logic of attrition demanded that British forces continue pressing forward, grinding down German reserves even at enormous cost to themselves. Each day brought fresh casualties, fresh grief for families across Britain and the Commonwealth. The Somme had become a symbol of everything wrong with the conduct of the war. Politicians who had promised swift victory were now forced to explain why the flower of British youth was being sacrificed for a few yards of French countryside. The public began to question not just the competence of their military leaders, but the very purpose of the war itself. The questions that had seemed so simple in 1914 now appeared impossibly complex. What were British soldiers dying for? Was the capture of a few miles of devastated French farmland worth the destruction of an entire generation? The answers that had satisfied politicians and generals in the comfortable safety of London seemed hollow to the men rotting in the trenches of the Somme. As the weeks dragged on after that catastrophic first day, the true scope of the disaster began to emerge. The casualty reports that trickled back to London painted a picture so grim that many officials simply refused to believe them. How could a single day's fighting have cost more lives than some entire campaigns of previous wars? How could the most powerful military force in British history have been so completely outmaneuvered by an enemy that was supposedly on the brink of collapse? The answer lay in the fundamental misunderstanding of modern warfare that had plagued Allied commanders since the beginning of the conflict. They were fighting a 20th century war with 19th century tactics, sending men armed with rifles and bayonets against machine guns and artillery. The romantic notion of cavalry charges and glorious infantry assaults had been rendered obsolete by industrial killing machines that could mow down hundreds of men in minutes. Yet the lessons of July 1st were ignored by those in command. Field Marshal Haig, rather than accepting responsibility for the disaster, instead blamed his subordinates and the quality of his troops. In his dispatches to London, he claimed that the attack had achieved its objectives, that German resistance was weakening, and that victory was just around the corner. The reality on the ground told a very different story. The men who had survived the opening assault found themselves trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no end. The German positions that were supposed to have been obliterated by the bombardment remained largely intact. Machine gun nests that should have been silenced continued to rake the British lines with deadly fire. Artillery positions that were meant to be destroyed kept raining shells down on anyone who dared to move in daylight. The no-man's land between the opposing trenches became a hellscape of shell holes and rotting corpses. Bodies of British soldiers lay scattered across the battlefield, some hanging on the uncut wire like grotesque scarecrows. The summer heat accelerated decomposition, creating a stench so overwhelming that even hardened veterans were sickened. Gas masks, originally designed to protect against chemical weapons, became necessary just to breathe near the front lines. Supply lines that had been planned to support a rapid advance instead became death traps. Every attempt to bring food, ammunition, or medical supplies to the forward positions was met with devastating fire from German observers who had clear views of the British rear areas. Men went days without hot food, surviving on cold rations and contaminated water. Wounded soldiers lay in shell holes for hours or even days before stretcher bearers could reach them, if they could be reached at all. The psychological toll was perhaps even more devastating than the physical casualties. Men who had enlisted with dreams of heroic adventure found themselves living like rats in flooded holes in the ground. The camaraderie that had sustained the Pals Battalions through training and the journey to France was shattered by the random nature of death on the battlefield. Friends who had shared jokes over breakfast were corpses by lunchtime. Brothers who had promised their mothers they would look after each other were separated forever by a few yards of blood-soaked earth. Shell shock, a condition that military doctors barely understood, began to claim victims by the thousands. Men who had shown incredible bravery under fire suddenly found themselves unable to stop shaking. Veterans who had survived months of trench warfare broke down completely after witnessing the slaughter of July 1st. Some were court-martialed for cowardice. Others were quietly evacuated to hospitals where they stared blankly at walls, unable to speak about what they had seen. The home front was equally devastated by the continuing casualties. The initial shock of July 1st had been terrible enough, but as the battle dragged on through July, August and September, The steady stream of death notifications never seemed to end. Families who had already mourned one son received word that another had fallen. Wives who had lost husbands discovered that their brothers or fathers had also been killed. Entire family lines were wiped out in the space of a few weeks. The economic impact was equally severe. Britain's industrial towns, already struggling with wartime production demands, lost thousands of skilled workers to the Somme. Factories that had been converted to munitions production found themselves short-staffed as their most experienced employees were reported missing or killed in action. The very men who had built Britain's industrial might were being consumed by the war machine they had helped create. The class divisions that had defined British society for centuries began to break down under the weight of shared grief. Working-class families who had lost sons in the Pals Battalions found themselves mourning alongside upper-class families whose officer sons had been killed, leading the same doomed attacks. The traditional deference to authority that had characterized British society was replaced by bitter questioning of the decisions that had led to such carnage. Religious faith, which had sustained many families through the early years of the war, began to crack under the strain of inexplicable loss. How could a benevolent God allow such suffering? What divine plan could justify the sacrifice of an entire generation? Churches that had been packed with congregations praying for victory found themselves struggling to explain why those prayers seemed to go unanswered. Some clergy abandoned their posts, unable to reconcile their faith with the reality of industrial slaughter. The propaganda machine that had sustained public support for the war effort began to lose its effectiveness. Posters showing heroic soldiers charging toward glorious victory rang hollow when compared to the letters arriving from the front lines. Newspaper accounts of strategic successes could not mask the endless casualty lists that filled page after page. The gap between official accounts and lived reality became too wide to bridge with patriotic rhetoric. Musicians and poets who had once celebrated the romance of warfare began to produce works of a very different character. The jingoistic songs that had filled music halls in 1914 gave way to haunting melodies that captured the sorrow of a nation in mourning. Poetry that had once glorified military service now spoke of waste, futility, and the betrayal of youth by age. The cultural landscape of Britain was being reshaped by the reality of mechanized death. Medical advances that had been driven by necessity began to change how society understood injury and trauma. Prosthetic limbs, once crude and uncomfortable, were refined to help the thousands of amputees returning from France. Plastic surgery, still in its infancy, developed rapidly as doctors struggled to rebuild faces destroyed by shrapnel and bullets. Mental health treatment, previously focused on restraint and confinement, began to evolve as the scale of psychological casualties became impossible to ignore. The women left behind were forced to take on roles that had previously been exclusively male domains. Factories, farms, and offices that had lost their male workers to the trenches were staffed by wives, daughters, and sisters who proved just as capable as the men they replaced. This social transformation, born of necessity and tragedy, would have lasting implications far beyond the war itself. The rigid gender roles that had defined Victorian society were crumbling along with everything else. The empire that had sent men from across the globe to fight on the Somme was also being transformed by the experience. Canadian, Australian, South African, and Indian units that had fought alongside British troops brought home stories of incompetent leadership and senseless sacrifice. The blind loyalty to the mother country that had characterized colonial attitudes began to give way to more critical assessments of British leadership. The seeds of future independence movements were being planted in the mud of northern France. Even the German forces, despite their tactical success in repelling the British attacks, were deeply affected by what they had witnessed. Many German soldiers wrote home about the bravery of their British opponents, expressing admiration for men who had walked into certain death with such discipline and courage. The mechanical nature of the killing, the industrial scale of the slaughter, troubled veterans on both sides who had entered the war expecting something resembling traditional combat. As autumn approached and the battle finally began to wind down, both sides could look back on months of fighting that had achieved virtually nothing except the destruction of human life on an unprecedented scale. The strategic objectives that had justified the offensive remained unrealized. The German lines, though battered, remained intact. The breakthrough that would end the war was as elusive as ever. All that had been accomplished was the transformation of a generation of young men into statistics in history books. The lessons of the Somme would eventually reshape military doctrine, but not before millions more would die in similar attacks. The combination of outdated tactics and modern weapons that had proven so deadly on July 1st would continue to claim victims until the very end of the war. The price of military education was being paid in human lives, and the tuition was higher than any civilization had ever been asked to bear. The Somme stands today not as a monument to military genius, but as a testament to the terrible cost of human folly. July 1st, 1916, changed everything. It shattered the illusion that war was glorious, that sacrifice was always meaningful, that leaders were infallible. In a single morning, 19,000 young men died for gains that could be measured in yards rather than miles. The big push became the big tragedy, and Britain would never be the same. The fields of northern France still hold the echoes of that catastrophic day. Walk through the Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemeteries that dot the landscape, and you'll find row upon row of headstones marking lives cut short by decisions made in comfortable rooms far from the front lines. These were not just soldiers. They were sons, fathers, brothers, friends. They were the Accrington Pals, the Sheffield City Battalion, the Leeds Pals. They were an entire generation that trusted their leaders and paid the ultimate price for that trust. The Somme reminds us that the true cost of war is not measured in strategic objectives achieved or territory gained. It's measured in the tears of mothers who never saw their sons again, in the silence of streets where laughter once echoed, in the dreams that died with the dreamers. July 1st, 1916, was indeed the bloodiest day in history. But more than that, it was the day innocence died and the modern world was born in blood and mud.